Welcome to the Halacha podcast Laman Yishmu with Harav Yosef Yeshaya Braun, Mara Da'asra, and a member of the Crown Heights Beis Din. This podcast is brought to you by the Ask the Rav platform in partnership with Laman Yilmedu, the premier institute for practical halacha learning.
So we have some interesting questions this week. I'll start with one which is relevant the whole year, but it's also relevant for Pesach. There's a halacha that if you're eating food that's dipped into a liquid that's wet, in one of the 7 different liquids, then you're obligated to wash your hands. Since there's a machlokes about this, there's a dispute, therefore we wash our hands without a bracha. Indeed, that's the reason why urchatz, at the seder, we wash our hands before we eat the karpas, because the karpas is a wet, dipped food, a dipped vegetable. So the question being asked is, what about a food that you normally eat with a fork? So if you normally don't eat it with a fork or spoon, and you don't eat it with your hands, you wouldn't have to wash your hands. And if that's correct, what is chicken considered? Is that something you normally eat with a fork? It might be more proper to eat it with a fork, but many people end up eating their chicken with their hands. So if it's wet chicken, would you have to wash your hands before eating it? So first of all, if the chicken was not cooked in one of the 7 liquids that are considered a mashka according to Torah, which could technically transmit impurity. The 7 liquids are water, wine, oil, milk. But you wouldn't have milk with chicken anyhow. Dew, honey, or blood. And most people wouldn't have blood in their chicken. So, for example, if you take a chicken and you cook it and boil it with its own juice, not adding water, you wouldn't have to wash. But what if it was boiled in water, was fried in oil? It's actually what we call a davar shetibula b'mashka. How do you define what's the normal way of eating it? If it's something that commonly people eat with their hands, you have to wash, even if you're currently eating with a spoon or fork. If it's commonly eaten with a fork or spoon, then you do not have to wash unless you're currently eating it with your hands. Let me explain this halacha very, very clearly. Something which is normally eaten with a spoon, if you eat, or a fork, if you eat it with a spoon or a fork, and it's normally eaten that way, you don't have to wash. The definition of normal means that it's very common to eat like that. The lashon of the Alter Rebbe is pa'amim rabos. Many times it's eaten with a spoon or fork. It doesn't mean it's always eaten like that. The only time, if it's regularly eaten with a spoon or fork, and you are eating it with a spoon or fork, you don't have to wash. Only something which is la'olam einay nechel b'kaf, it's never eaten with a spoon or fork, then you do have to wash. One of the examples brought in halacha is basar mevushlas, cooked chicken. So cooked chicken is something that is normally eaten with a spoon or fork. It is normal. And if you're going to be eating with a spoon or fork, you wouldn't have to wash. But now it gets a bit more trickier. Something which is normal to eat, and as we explained, the Alter Rebbe defines very clearly, normal means pa'amim rabbis, many times. But if it's normal to eat with a spoon or fork, and you ended up touching it with your hands, so if you look carefully in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, and the Mishnah Berurah quotes this Alter Rebbe as well, the Alter Rebbe is very particular to write, if it's normally eaten with a fork, and you b'mikra accidentally, as an occurrence, it wasn't a planned thing, you went and touched with your hands in the spoon or in the fork, then you don't have to wash. So that means that the heter of not washing, because it's normally eaten with a spoon, is if it's normally, and you're also eating with a spoon, and you might have by chance touched it, I understand, but if you're going deliberately and going to touch it with your hands, it doesn't help the fact that it's normally eaten with a spoon or fork. That seems to be very, very clear. And this is relevant for karpas. Some people say that when you're dipping in your karpas, whatever vegetable you're using, potato, onion, depending on custom, you shouldn't dip it in with a spoon and fork, because if you should have to do it with your hands. Okay, granted. But there's an argument that goes even more, that people who use potatoes are normally eaten with a spoon, cooked potato. If they're normally eaten with a spoon, there's no point in washing. And if there's no point in washing, you really shouldn't wash, because Chazal tell us, Hanoitul Yadav Lepetus, if somebody washes for fruits and vegetables that are not wet, it's a form of arrogance. We wash for bread or for wet food. So if you have cooked potatoes, which is made to be eaten with a spoon, why should you wash for karpas? But if you go back to what I mentioned before from the Alter Rebbe, the fact that it's normally eaten with a spoon means that we're not worried that you might end up touching with your hand. And if you touched it accidentally, derech mikra, or by chance, you don't have to wash. But if you're going to eat it with your hands, for sure you would have to wash. Even if it's normal to eat with a spoon. So therefore, when it comes to the karpas, if somebody's eating potatoes, the fact that it's normally eaten with a spoon, who cares? But right now, you're dipping it with your hand, and you're eating with your hand, of course you have to wash. Liquid is very, very different. Over there, even if you're drinking with your hands, that's not the normal way of doing it. But here we're talking specifically about food. How do you define the definition of normal? So if most people, commonly it's eaten with your hand, and you decide to eat with a spoon, butler, daitoi, we say that what you do is different than everybody else, and we consider this a food that's eaten by hand. If everybody eats with a spoon, and you eat with a hand, so that's the same as someone who takes a food that's eaten with a spoon and he uses his hands, he would have to wash, unless it's b'mikra, unless it's just by chance. I think that's pretty clear. Let's move on to another question about Netilas Yadayim as well. Someone wrote to me that he saw a contemporary sefer quoting an Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch. He couldn't find this Alter Rebbe. And it seems from there that if somebody is washing his hands for bread, this is also a Netilas Yadayim question, and there's water that touched his unwashed hand, and water went into the cup of Netilas Yadayim, the cup has to be emptied and dried before refilling it. And that's an extreme thing, that every time that some water got touched, you have to empty all the water and even dry it. Now, I know there were certain chassidim that did not like when someone filled the cup of water for them, they would go and empty it out. I never saw people drying it, and maybe there might have been certain chassidim that actually did that as well. There's people before that washed, and they didn't wash properly. You have no idea if the water's tahir or tamei. So they would always empty it out. But where does this Alter Rebbe come from? So indeed, actually, this Alter Rebbe is actually found in Shulchan Aruch. And what the Alter Rebbe is saying over there is about a halacha as follows. That there's something called Mayim Rishonim, that's the water the first time you wash your hands, and there's something called Mayim Shnim, the second time you wash your hands. The Alter Rebbe is found, for those who want to look it up, it's in Siman Kuf Samach Beis, in the end of Sif Tez Zayin, in the parentheses. Mayim Shnim is the second time you wash your hands. Now, Mayim Shnim, the second time washing, purifies the first washing. The first washing touched the hand and the first water became tamei. So you wash the second time, so the second waters purify the first waters. But if somebody will touch water that was poured on the ground, water not on a person's hand, water in some other area, you can pour a mayim shnim there, that water, if that water was tamei, that water doesn't become tahor again. Doesn't make a difference how much you pour the second time. And Alter Rebbe concludes and writes, therefore, if someone has a large container and he takes a small dish and he draws water out with a large container, and the rim of the small container is wet with impure water, he could immerse into a very large container. It doesn't accomplish anything. The water that's on the rim, which was impure, remains impure. So seemingly this will imply, the argument goes, that if you have non-pure water, because the person didn't wash his hands properly, whatever he touched his hand, which wasn't washed, that impure water will never become nullified. And you could fill up the cup with so much more water, fresh water, it's not going to help. Now, that argument might be true, and some people argue that's indeed the position of the Alter Rebbe, but it's not 100% conclusive that is correct. Over there, the Alter Rebbe was talking about when the water is in the original spot. At the rim, there was impure water. Now, we add more water, and we're putting this small container small cup into a big container. That water that stays there stays impure. But if the water moves to another place, there might be a different halacha. There's also a distinction between pure water going on to impure or impure going into pure water. It could also be that even if it's not nullified, that water remains impure. But now when you're washing, you have a full amount of kosher water, arguably. It could also be that at the rim that doesn't mix very, very well. There's a lot of arguments to say why this Alter Rebbe is not 100% conclusive. Never mind the fact that this Alter Rebbe is in parentheses. We know when the Alter Rebbe writes something in parentheses, there's a number of theories why he did so. One of them is because he might have had a doubt. So yes, there were Chassidim that were worried that maybe the original water that was there was not kosher water, and they would empty it out, and I understand that. I've never seen people going and drying it, and arguably they didn't take the Chumrah that far to go and dry the original water. Talking about stringencies of the Alter Rebbe, there's a particular stringency which is associated with Pesach, and many poskim said to adopt this. The Alter Rebbe instituted that when people sell their Chometz to a goy for Pesach, for Mechiras Chometz, they should make sure when the goy has to pay for all the Chometz that he bought, it's not enough that he gives a deposit. He has to bring with him a guarantor, otherwise known as an Areiv Kablan, for payment for the rest of the money. So technically, the guy is really paying for the full amount of money. He's buying off all the chametz in town. He's giving a very small deposit, but he's coming with a document, with a star of a guarantor for the rest of the money. And he hands over to the Rav the deposit plus that document, which means he's paid in full. And according to the Alter Rebbe, this is very, very important. And if you don't do like that, it's questionable whether you might be violating Bal Yirah, Bal Yamatzim, and HaTorah. This is a very, very serious matter. And therefore, people who are selling the Chametz should make sure to sell through a Rav that utilizes the method of Areiv Kablan. And Chabad Chassidim are very particular about that. The question was, after Pesach, people are buying Chometz, and they're buying Chometz from stores. And some of these stores did not necessarily use an Areiv Kablan. Is there any room to be particular after Pesach not to buy Chometz from such stores? No, there's no such thing. First of all, it's almost impossible to be particular about this. Most people are not particular about Areiv Kablan, only Chabad. Even if you know for a fact that the person at this bakery uses Areiv Kablan, but he got ingredients, he got products, there's so many things that go into it, it eventually will boil down to some chametz that was sold not with Areiv Kablan. Never mind the fact, this is the reason why after Pesach you cannot have benefit from chametz that wasn't sold properly on Pesach, that's a penalty for people who didn't sell the chametz. But if a person sold his chametz because he follows a different opinion that you don't need to have an Areiv Kablan, how can we penalize someone who did the right thing? In fact, there's some people hold you're not supposed to have an Areiv Kablan. That's not our position. They're incorrect. But so somebody who didn't sell his chametz by mistake, that's a whole different story. And even that is room for arguments. If it was a shoygig or an oinus, we can argue about that. I'm not going to go into that right now. But if a person sold his chametz, he did the right thing, but he has a different way how to do it. We're talking about, it's a penalty. A penalty is not as serious as the selling chametz is min HaTorah. Over there we're very strict. It's the issue of Bal Yirah. After Pesach, it's a question of a drabanan, of a penalty. Over there's room to be lenient. Besides for the fact that there's many different ways how the guy acquires the chametz. Money is one way, and he has to have a guarantor for the money. But there's other methods. When the Alter Rebbe says if a person didn't sell properly, that he violates, he's talking about violating Bal Yirah, he's not talking about what happens after Pesach. I will also point out that using an Areiv Kablan, the Alter Rebbe says that according to some of the Rishonim, you need to use an Areiv Kablan. The Tzemach Tzedek writes, Das Kol HaRishonim, all the other Rishonim hold you wouldn't need that. So we're trying to make sure that we cover our bases according to those Rishonim. And this is indeed the accepted position amongst almost all Chabad Rabbanim, and they in fact mock the idea of being stringent and not to buy such kind of chametz. There is some rumor which is unsubstantiated that the Rebbe was particular dafka to buy chametz after Pesach from somebody using Areiv Kablan. We don't know if that rumor is correct, and even if all those details about this rumor would be correct, and I have strong reason to suspect it's not correct, this could have been a personal thing of the Rebbe. It could have been a temporary thing. The Rebbe didn't want to strengthen someone that's doing the wrong thing. It's not something we necessarily have to learn from that. And moving on from this Pesach question, I'm going to go into another Pesach question. And this question is not only related to Pesach, it's related to chuppahs. It's a dicta question. In the seder, it says, in the Haggadah, it says, Matzah zu sha'anu oichlan. Is it Matzah zu or Matzah zoi? Which one is correct? For that matter, when people give a ring to the kala under the chuppah, and they say, Harei at mekudeshes li b'tabas zu or b'tabas zoi. Some chassan teachers tell the chassanim to be particular to say it in a certain way. Some of them tell them to say zu, and some tell them to say zay. Which one is it? So let's start with the Pesach story of the Haggadah. The Rebbe was asked this question by one of the nights of the seder. This was in the year Tafshin Chav Zayin, and the Rebbe was asked that in the seder it says matzah zu with a malupin or a shuruk. In the Haggadah referring here to the Haggadah that the Rebbe wrote a Pirush on the Haggadah, and when they were asking the Rebbe this question, they were referring to the Haggadah that we have, that the Rebbe printed a Haggadah. This year marks 60 years from when the Rebbe's Haggadah was printed in Tafshin Vav, and it's a good time to sit and study the Rebbe's Haggadah Shal Pesach im Likutei Taimim Menhagim. So the Rebbe was asked why the Siddur it says Matzah Zu, but in your Haggadah it says Matzah Zoi. And the Rebbe's response was that the Haggadah he made sure to copy from Siddur Torah Eir. The Rebbe's grandfather, Avram David Lavut, published a Siddur. He was very particular with Nekudas. In fact, the Nekudas there are often different than other Siddurim. And he wrote Matzah Zoi, and the Rebbe said he copied the Haggadah, the Nusach from the Haggadah, straight from there, not from other Siddurim. This is what the Rebbe said. This what the Rebbe said then is written down in different places. In Teres Menachem it's brought down very briefly, but in other records of this conversation, this is pretty much the conversation. On another occasion, the Rebbe was asked again about this topic, and the Rebbe said it is a printing mistake. It's pretty obvious if you want to compare it. This was in Tafshin Lamed, the second night Pesach. 3 years before, the Rebbe said that Matzah Zoi was the way it was written by his grandfather, which was very particular and medayik in how he makes Nekudah. So when the Rebbe said it's a printing mistake, he's obviously referring to the Siddur, the Siddurim that have Matzah Zu. For some reason, in most versions of this conversation, it says it is a printing mistake without saying what it is. Some of the people that write the Sichas try to polish up the words, and they wrote, the one that's in the Haggadah is a typo, is a Toyos Atfus, which is hard to accept that the Rebbe would say that. The Rebbe said that in Tafshin Lamed, and it was never changed in the Haggadah. And he just 3 years before said in Tafshin Chav Zayin that in the Haggadah was printed that way because he copied it from the Siddur, which was very particular for his Nekudas. If you look in the Alter Rebbe Siddur, in fact, most of the Siddurim, and actually isn't with a Choyla Matzah Zoi as well, so unlikely it's a typo. There's one of the original first medaktikim of Siddur was an individual by the name of the Pshapsi Sofer. He writes in his Siddur, in the Haggadah section, that it's supposed to be Matzah Zoi with a Choylam. And in fact, many times in his Pirush on the Siddur, he writes how it's supposed to be with a Choylam, and certain things are supposed to be with a Malupin, Zu. In the Haggadah we have Esalachas, Zu Atchak, Zoi Prishu Zarecheres, and he talks about all of that. Same with Harei Mekudeshes Li. If you look in the Siddur, depending which Siddur, in the Siddur Imdach Siddur, which has Amarim in it, it says V'tabaz Zoi. In Siddur Torah, V'tabaz Zoi, and that's how it's printed now till Hashem Siddur. In the early prints of the Alter Rebbe Siddur, there was no Nekudas at all, so you can't learn from that. Some of the prints had V'tabaz Zu, but following the same logic of Matzah, there should be, like Reb Shapsi Sefer writes, Matzah Zoi, V'tabaz should also be V'tabaz Zoi, and in fact, many people comment that Zoi is the more correct way of saying it. In Tanakh, we have the word Zoi a number of times. Sometimes it says Zoi with a Hey, not Zayin Vav, Zayin Hey, which would usually be Zeh, but there's a note that it should be read as Zoi. Zoi Ha'ir Gam Zoi. And we have some other times the word Zoi. There's a pasuk in Tehillim Ve'idoi say Zoi Alamdim. Pasuk Zoi La'agam. So many pasukim with the word Zoi. And in manuscripts of Chazal, in Chazal the word Zoi is Zayin Vav is much more common than the word Zeh. So in some of the manuscripts which have Nekudas, and actually the Nekudas are Zoi, not Zu, and Sfardim and Yemenites, which are very particular about these things, when they learn a Gemara, they say the word Zoi. Ashkenazim are not particular, they say Zu very often. Now we do find the word Zu in Tanakh as well. In the Shir, in Az Yashar, you have Am Zu Galta. Amzu Kanisa, you have that word as well. But Mefarshim say that the word Zu in Hebrew, Amzu, means the nation, Am, the nation, Zu, that, Galta, you redeemed. Amzu Yatzarti Li. Actually, the Haftarah of this week's Parsha Vayikra. The Radak writes that as well. In Matzah Zu, you can't say Matzah Zu. The Matzah that, Sha'anu Eichem, that we eat, that's repetitive. The Matzah that we eat, that wouldn't make sense. Also, the word matzah is feminine. The word tabas is feminine. When it's zoi, it's feminine. When it's zu, it could be used for masculine as well. Now, there are some exceptions to all these rules. I'm afraid to talk about this. But in a nutshell, that's pretty much a standard except. In fact, some contemporary poskim write that the more accurate way, they don't talk about matzah, they talk about tabas, should be tabas zoi. Now, it's not such a big deal if you say matzah zu, matzah zoi, both have a level of accuracy attached to them. We have a rule that Ibn Ezra writes, anything which is not a living thing, zachreu v'nakveu. Kol davar she'en beiruach chaim, zachreu v'nakveu. You could say masculine, you could say feminine, you could say zu, you could say zoi. No, if it's matzah zu or zoi, either way it should be mekayim the mitzvahs matzah properly. And if it's tabaz zu, she's certainly mekudeshes either way. Different question altogether. Moving on, somebody is eating eating fish for argument's sake, and then he's also sipping a tea. So he wants to finish eating the fish and make a bracha chorina on the fish, but he wants to continue sipping tea. So can I make the bracha chorina, the burden of fresh, just for the fish, not for the tea? The short answer is, there's a machlokes if you can do that. You should really avoid doing something like that. Only make one bracha chorina when you finish the tea. What's the basis of this machlokes? So, in fact, the Pri Megadim already addresses this twice, both in his Psichet and his Brachas and his Sefer Eshel Avram on the Magen Avram. And he writes that bracha achroina is very different than bracha rishonim. We have in the rishonim already distinguishing between bracha rishonim and bracha achroina similarly, but he writes this, that bracha achroina has nothing to do with your kavanah. If a person is obligated to make a bracha on a couple of foods, which have the same exact bracha, you thought about one food, who cares what you thought about? It covers everything automatically. Now, there is a machlokes about bracha rishonim as well. If you could have kavanah and say, it should only work for one thing. It's not so clear about that also. And now about bracha achroina, it gets a bit more confusing. The Pri Megadim doesn't say what he's talking about. Is he talking about that you clearly had in mind it shouldn't exempt another food? Is that what he's saying? When he says lav b'kavana tali milsa, it's not dependent on your kavana. It implies even if you clearly had in mind it should only go for one food, not for another, it doesn't work. You finished. You made a bracha achroina. It's over. So there's a disagreement what he actually means. The problem is that we have a sefer, one of the Rishonim called Sefer Habatim, and he writes a person ate two foods, made one bracha, and he clearly had in mind only for one food. It will only cover that food. It seems like he's talking about that he clearly had in mind. So Sefer Habatim goes against the Pri Megadim, and the Sefer Habatim is a Rishon. Some want to say that Sefer Habatim follows the position of Mrs. Srichas Kavana. We are choshed that maybe Mrs. Ein Srichas Kavana. Depending if you need to have kavanah when you do a mitzvah. So according to the Sefer Habatim, everything's dependent on your kavanah. If you only had kavanah for one food, it won't work for the other food. Okay, pilpul, this is becoming very, very confusing. And this is connected with another shaila, which is in Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Magen Avram says that when you make a bracha achroina, you finished eating. But if you made a mistake and made a bracha achroina, that works very differently. If you make a mistake and it's not considered that you finished eating, only if you deliberately made a bracha achroina. But they don't talk about if you make a bracha achroina, but you're having a mind only for one food, not for another food. So because of this complication over here, it's usually not recommended to go into this shaila. This is a question of a suffix brachas. We don't go into sfekas about brachas. Also, if you're making a bracha achroina only for one food, not for another food, you could go into a shaila of a bracha she'ein tzaricha sometimes. Some people talk about this, that if a person is very worried that the time of the digestion, the time of the bracha the bracha has a lifetime, it can't last for too long, and he's worried that it'll be past Shir Ikul, maybe it's a good idea to quickly go or you're afraid you can forget a bracha achroina, make a bracha achroina, and then continue eating the other foods. It is a complicated thing. We don't normally recommend people should do that because they're going to run into serious shilas. We spoke about Pesach. Let's talk about Tzar and Purim, but it has to do with Pesach as well. And it's about drinking on Purim. I know Purim just was. The Arizal writes in a sefer called Pri Eitz Chaim, Kizvei Arizal, and he writes something interesting, which is not very well known, that on Purim we're supposed to have shtia meruba ma'achila. He explains Kabbalistically why on Purim you should drink more than you eat. This is brought in Pri Eitz Chaim, in Machberes HaKodesh, in various manuscripts of the Arizal. The Mefarshim is Hagos Maritzemach, Hagos Marnash. they talk about why Kabbalistically doesn't make sense. They give a whole explanation why you should drink more than eating. Well, I don't know too many people. Some people do a lot of drinking on Purim, but in a typical Sudas Purim, we do more eating than drinking. We be Mekayim this Arizal. Now, one thing we know, when something is in the Pri Etz Chaim, that doesn't necessarily mean it's authentic. We know that in the Arizal's manuscripts, there's a manuscript called Shmoyne Sha'arim. It has 8 different gates. One of them is Shara Kavanas. The Shmoyne Sha'arim are the most accurate description, accurate representation of the Arizal's position. The Pri Etz Chaim is not that accurate. So we need to look as if it's in Pri Etz Chaim. Whatever's in Pri Etz Chaim is often found in Shara Kavanas. Is this found in Shara Kavanas? Well, it is actually in Shara Kavanas in the end of the Drushim of Purim, but as Shmuel Vital, the son of Reb Chaim Vital, the scribe of the Arizal, writes a few lines before this, until here is all the Drushim Shalarav of the Arizal. That means, till here was the Arizal. This new section, where it talks about drinking more than eating, is not from the original words of the Arizal. In the language of the Kabbalists, it's not soyless nakia, it's not pure flour. Reb Chaim Vital's writings are considered soyless nakia, pure. So if this is not so authentic, maybe we don't have to practice. That sounds like a very good explanation why people don't do it. In fact, in the Shara Kavanas itself, it seems like you're not supposed to drink much more. There's other contradictions. In one place, he writes, you should become shikr on Purim v'yetzim midaito, go out of your mind. In another place, it says, in Reb Chaim Vital's writings, shelo yishtaker eli's basim, don't become shikr, just drink extra. And people talk about how to reconcile these contradictions. So we have a bit of a mess over here. What's going on? Also, the idea of shtia being meruba ma'achilas contradicts a different Shara Kavanas. Kabbalistically, it's hard to understand. The idea is because Moichin the Imma come down, Purim is all about Moichin the Abba. There's a problem over here. Moirav Shamash, which is a sefer from one of the Talmida Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe writes about the sefer Moirav Shamash, a sefer which is studied in a lot of Polish circles. The Rebbe quotes what he writes at Shabbosim, the 3 weeks of the High Shabbosim, and he writes that Kadosh Elin have said that. The Rebbe comments, "Who hoya mitalmid talmida Baal Shem Tov." He was a student of the students of Baal Shem Tov. When he says Kadosh Elin, he means the Baal Shem Tov and his students. In Moirav Shamash writes that on Purim we eat more than we drink, and he gives a whole explanation because Yesod Abba. So do we eat more or do we drink more? Well, some people do drink more, but most people don't. The Rashash of Shalom Sharabi was very into the authenticity of the writings of the Arizal. He actually brings, he should beferish, Yishte beribu yoisv nachila. Drink more than what you eat. And this is quoted in many Svarim Shallah, Turbarekes, and it's also quoted in Chassidus. The idea, they don't quote it from the Arizal, but they talk about it. Chlal, you eat more than you drink. Purim, this idea of drinking, they talk according to Chassidus, what that means drinking. Drinking means agadata, achila means nigla, and how it's more drinking. So this is, it says, they say in the name of the Alter Rebbe that generally the Gemara says Dashal Torah, the Torah approach, eating is more than drinking. Purim is a nafech, so Purim, drinking is more than eating. In fact, in the Megillah it says you may mishta. You want it to be a mishta, you want it to be a suda. You can't get mishta. Mishta means that's the main thing, has to be drinking. The truth is that it's actually called Sudas Purim and Halach in the Gemara. And Achashverosh's meal was called a Mishta, and the Gemara says Achashverosh's meal had more eating than drinking. So from the word Mishta, what improve the word Mishta means a meal that Rambam says you should make a Suda, not a proper Suda, and drink wine in your meal. But either way, clearly wine has to be a fundamental part of the meal. You can maybe even eat more. Every Yom Tov is supposed to be Kovea Sudase Alayayim, establish a meal based on wine. A Suda, Rashi writes in the beginning of Shir Hashirim, Ki Toibim Doidechem Yoyin, any Suda is based on the wine. That's why we use the word Mishta for a meal. Rashi writes in Megillah Sester, because every meal is Al Shem Yayin, the wine is Iker. So whether there should be more drinking or not, but it has to be a fundamental part of it for those who are capable of drinking wine, which in Amal, that was a proper kosher meal, always had wine. Their wine was not as strong as our wine. Their wine was almost like Coca-Cola or juice. It was a lot of water added to their wine. They had strong wines, but they would add a lot of water to it. It could be when the Mekabalim write to do more drinking, they mean drinking should be a primary function. You drink more than you normally drink. You're not eating more than normal, although you're supposed to have an extra Sudas Purim. Mitzvah laharbas b'Sudas Purim, but you don't overdo the eating. So, and the meal of primary function of this meal, the primary aspect of it, and that's called more drinking than eating. Unless we're going to take a pshat, which doesn't sound too chassidish, not too many Russians will like this pshat, So when it says drinking more than eating, it maybe means drinking water. Not, I don't know if that's going to work with the Kabbalah, because if drinking is based on Mechiras the Imma, that should be associated with wine, not with water. We do find certain places that it talks about achila and shtia, whether which one should be more, and they associated with water. But the pashtus, when the Kabbalah writes shtia is more than achila, they mean shtias yain. The Eibishter Helfens, this is associated with Pesach. We also kaveya the seder on wine. Yom Tov is a mitzvah of oineg Yom Tov that was supposed to be kaveya suudasai al hayayin. It's a very interesting point that there's a mitzvah of oineg Shabbos and oineg Yom Tov. In Hilchas oineg Yom Tov, it's brought, you're supposed to establish every single meal of Yom Tov al hayayin, al wine. Wine, it's like a tea party, a wine party. It's a fundamental aspect. In Hilchas Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it. Ten lechachem yech k'may dikru should have the ayin hamashama of Mashiach, take it from Yad Mamish.
Join the global halacha learning revolution of the Laman Yilmedu Institute and bring increased brachos into your home. For details about the various learning programs, visit our website, lamanyilmedu.com. That's LEMAANYILMEDU.com.